The heater pulled the rivet out of the furnace at 1,800 degrees and threw it. The catcher was 40 feet away on an open beam 20 stories above the street. He had a metal cone and about half a second. If he missed, the rivet went somewhere specific. But that was not the part of the job that killed men most often. The open beam had no net, no harness, no fall protection of any kind. A man who lost his footing in the rain simply fell. The rivet was spectacular. The beam was what got you. If you are new to Steel and Sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the story of the four-man rivet gang, the basic unit of American structural steel construction from 1880 to 1950, and the men who built every skyscraper in the American city on open beams above the street with no protection between them and the ground. But construction records of the American structural steel industry make clear the rivet gang was not improvised. It was engineered and refined across hundreds of structures in dozens of American cities, and it worked exactly as its designers intended. The design did not include fall protection. The design included 4 men, a portable coke furnace, a set of tongs, a metal cone, a dolly bar, and a pneumatic hammer. That was what it took to connect structural steel at height, and that was sufficient to build everything. To understand why the rivet gang required 4 men working in a precise and unbroken sequence, you have to understand what a riveted connection was and why the 45-second window at the center of the process was not a target but a physical limit. A rivet was a cylindrical steel rod with a pre-formed head at one end. It was inserted while hot through pre-drilled holes in 2 overlapping steel members and hammered on the protruding end to form a second head, clamping the 2 steel sections together as it cooled. The structural value of a hot-driven rivet was not only in the mechanical connection it formed, it was in the contraction. A rivet inserted at working temperature and driven into its final shape would cool and shrink in place, drawing the connected steel members together with a clamping force that could not be achieved by a cold bolt of the same diameter. That contraction was load-bearing. It was built into the connection physics. But the rivet had to be driven before it cooled, because a rivet that cooled before it was fully driven was a bad rivet. And a bad rivet in a structural steel connection was a latent failure that could not be seen from the outside and would express itself under load. The working window between a rivet pulled from the furnace at the correct temperature and a rivet too cold to drive properly was roughly 45 seconds. Everything in the four-man gang's operation was organized around that window. The heater worked the portable coke furnace that every rivet gang carried with them as the structure rose. He heated rivets to working temperature, reading the temperature by color as each rod passed through the spectrum from black to orange to the bright cherry red that signaled it was ready. Before reaching the pale yellow that signaled it was approaching the point where it would be too hot and the steel would begin to lose structural integrity. He pulled a ready rivet from the furnace with long tongs, judged the distance to the catcher, and threw it. A good heater tracked the arc, adjusted for distance and wind, and delivered the rivet to the catcher's position with enough spin and angle that the catcher could receive it cleanly. He was also managing his queue, because in a productive gang, the catcher was consuming rivets at a rate that required continuous furnace management. A gap in supply stopped the sequence. A rivet pulled too early and held too long went cold. A rivet thrown at the wrong moment forced the catcher to catch under pressure or miss. The catcher received the rivet in a metal cone, a roughly conical sheet metal bucket that he held open end up to intercept the incoming rod. He then transferred the rivet immediately with his own tongs to the connection point, inserting it into the hole while the bucker-up positioned the dolly bar on the pre-formed headside. The catcher's position was determined by where the connection was, not where it was convenient to stand. On open structural steel, the connection was wherever the frame required it, which meant the catcher stood on whatever surface was available at that location. A beam flange 3 inches wide, a plank positioned across 2 members, or scaffolding hung from the steel itself. He stood there in summer heat and in November rain, receiving hot iron out of the air at a rate determined by the heater's pace and the gang's productivity target. The bucker held a heavy steel dolly bar against the preformed head of the inserted rivet from the back side of the connection, bracing it against the force of the riveter's hammer. He absorbed the hammer's reaction load through the bar and through his own body, which meant the vibration of every driven rivet transmitted through his hands, his arms, and his feet into whatever he was standing on. He could not see the riveter. He held position by feel and by the communication that had been established between him and the riveter through practice on previous connections. If the bucker-up's dolly bar slipped, or if the angle of his brace was wrong, the driven head would be malformed. A malformed head would pass visual inspection on a busy construction site in 1924 more often than it failed it. The inspection process for hot-driven rivets on structural steel projects in New York and Chicago through the building boom years was conducted by the general contractor's foreman, not by an independent inspector. The foreman's incentive was to keep the frame rising, not to pull out rivets that might be structurally marginal. The New York State Labor Bureau reports for structural ironwork accidents between 1900 and 1930 do not attribute any documented structural failure to bad rivets from a gang under production pressure. This is not evidence that bad rivets did not contribute to structural distress in this period. It is evidence that bad rivets in a structural connection were not the category of event the Labor Bureau's accident investigators were looking for. The pneumatic hammer weighed between 5 and 8 pounds in the early 20th century. It delivered a series of rapid impact blows that reshaped the protruding rivet stem into a second head through accumulated deformation. The hammer was connected to a compressed air line that ran down through the structure to a compressor at ground level, and the weight of the hose added to what the riveter carried every time he repositioned between connections. A productive riveter on a busy floor could drive 250 to 300 rivets in a 10-hour shift, rotating with the rest of the gang to give his arms and hands regular breaks from the hammer's constant vibration load. A gang that had worked together long enough developed a rhythm that compressed the time between rivets and kept every part of the sequence moving without wasted motion. A new gang, or a gang broken by an injury and refilled with an unfamiliar man, worked slower and made more bad rivets. By 1912, the International Association of Bridge and Structural Ironworkers reported 109 member deaths from a membership of 10,928. That is a fatality rate of 1,000 per 100,000 workers. United States soldiers in Afghanistan in 2010 died at approximately 500 per 100,000. The ironworkers in American cities during the skyscraper boom were dying at twice the rate of soldiers in an active combat theater in peacetime, building office buildings for corporations that had no legal obligation to provide them with fall protection of any kind. How do you step across a 4-inch beam flange in November rain on the 30th floor of a structure that does not yet have floors when the heater is waiting for your signal and the window is running? How does the bucker-up hold position against the dolly bar when the steel he is bracing against is still hot enough to burn through his gloves, and the hammer's vibration is transmitting into his feet through a beam that is moving slightly under the weight of other men repositioning elsewhere in the frame? Leave a comment below. But the rivet gang did not consist only of the 4 men working the connection. On a major structural steel project in New York City, Chicago, or Pittsburgh in the 1920s, dozens of gangs worked simultaneously across a rising frame, each with its own furnace and its own connection sequence, and the coordination between them was managed entirely by the raising gang foreman through a system of hand signals and shouted communication across open air. There was no radio. There was no intercom. The hand signals that told one gang to hold its throw while another gang below repositioned had to be visible across the noise and steam in the gap between floors, and misread hand signals on a structural steel frame had documented consequences in the State Labor Bureau records of New York, Illinois, and Pennsylvania throughout the building boom years from 1900 to 1930. The wages the ironworking trade paid reflected the risk in a way that the recorded fatality rate does not fully capture. In 1912, a journeyman ironworker in New York City earned between $4 to $5 per day at a time when unskilled construction labor earned between $1 to $2. The premium was explicit. It was the rate the market had settled on for men willing to work open steel at height with the tools and conditions available. It did not include compensation for injury. It did not include pension. When a riveter fell from the 32nd floor of the Woolworth Building in 1912, the construction record noted the interruption and the replacement. The official building record of the Woolworth Building, completed that year as the world's tallest structure, does not list the names of the men who fell during its construction. But the most remarkable chapter in the history of the rivet gang does not belong to New York's Irish, Italian, and Eastern European gangs, who made up the bulk of the structural ironworking workforce across the American building boom. It belongs to a specific community from the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, and it begins not with a skyscraper but with a bridge, and not with a success but with a catastrophe. In 1886, the Canadian Pacific Railroad sought to build a cantilever bridge across the St. Lawrence River, with one abutment landing on the land of the Kahnawake Mohawk Reservation near Montreal. In exchange for use of the land, the railroad and its contractor, the Dominion Bridge Company, agreed to employ Kahnawake men as laborers during construction. The company had intended to use them for materials handling, but the young Mohawk men were not interested in unloading. They climbed the steel. A Dominion Bridge Company official, quoted in a 1949 New Yorker article by Joseph Mitchell, described what happened when they got up there. The Mohawks walked the spans with the ease of men who had grown up navigating narrow logs across fast water, immune to the noise of riveting that made newcomers sick and dizzy. The foreman noticed they trained 12 Kahnawake men as riveters. Men who wanted to do riveting were rare, and men who could do it well were rarer still. In good construction years, there were sometimes too few experienced riveters to meet demand across the American and Canadian building industry. The Kahnawake gangs that emerged from those first 12 trained workers were not a novelty. They were skilled labor the industry needed. If you're finding this history as important as anything we've covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. Within 2 decades, Kahnawake riveting gangs were working across Canada and into the northeastern United States, training new men from the reservation on each job and carrying their apprentices with them through a system that passed the specific knowledge of the work from experienced men to new men the way the work itself demanded. By 1907, more than 70 skilled structural ironworkers from Kahnawake were working on bridge and building projects. Their reputation within the trade was not mythological. It was specific, and it was well known within the industry. These gangs were productive, their rivets were good, and they could work at height on open steel in conditions that drove other men off the beam. But the Kahnawake gangs paid for that reputation on the afternoon of August 29, 1907, above the St. Lawrence River. The Quebec Bridge was under construction south of Quebec City, a cantilevered truss span designed by American structural engineer Theodore Cooper that would extend more than 3,000 feet across the river when complete. 70 Kahnawake men were on the crew, working the southern arm of the structure. The bridge had been poorly engineered from the outset. Weight calculations made in the planning stage had never been checked against the completed design, and the southern arm had grown heavier than the specifications allowed as construction extended outward. At roughly 5:30 in the afternoon, a Kahnawake riveting gang leader named Alexander Beauvais reported to the site engineer that 2 rivets had broken near a splice and that ribs were bending under load. What do you do when you report what you see and the man with authority tells you it is nothing? The site engineer told him it was nothing serious. Beauvais walked back onto the bridge. Within minutes, the southern arm and the central section of the Quebec Bridge collapsed into the St. Lawrence River. 96 men died in the span of seconds, and 35 of them were from Kahnawake. In a community of several hundred working-age men, that loss cut through every extended family on the reservation. The graves of the fallen iron workers at Kahnawake are marked with crosses made from lengths of steel girder. The women of Kahnawake could not stop their men from going back to the high steel. The wages were too high, and the identity of the Kahnawake ironworker was already too deeply embedded in the community for any prohibition to hold. But they could impose a structural rule. No single gang could be composed entirely of men from the same family. The gangs were required to mix their membership so that no single structural failure could again take every ironworker in a family line at once. This practice, called booming out, became the organizing principle of how Kahnawake men distributed themselves across construction projects for the rest of the riveting era. It was not a company policy. It was not a regulation. It was a decision made by the women of the community the months after the Quebec bridge disaster, and the men accepted it. By the 1920s, the Kahnawake gangs had arrived in New York City, and they found the work that would define them. The Hellgate Bridge in 1916 was their introduction to the Manhattan construction market. Through the 1920s, they worked the Hellgate and moved to other building projects as the New York skyline entered its defining decade. The Chrysler Building rose from 1928 to 1930. Kahnawake riveting gangs worked it floor by floor, driving the connections that held the Art Deco frame together while standing on open steel with birds flying at the same altitude. No safety lines, no helmets, no nets below. Before the Chrysler was complete, the Empire State Building had broken ground less than a mile away, and Kahnawake men were there for that too. They worked the George Washington Bridge, Rockefeller Center, and the RCA Building. Every major structural steel project in the New York metropolitan area in the late 1920s and through the 1930s had Kahnawake men working its rivet gangs. The community they built in Brooklyn during those years was called Little Kahnawake, centered near 4th Avenue and Atlantic Street in the neighborhood then known as North Gowanus. At its peak in the late 1930s, it held roughly 800 Mohawk men and their families within 10 square blocks. A bar called the Wigwam kept Montreal ale in stock and had a sign above the door that read, "The greatest ironworkers in the world pass through these doors." This was not a boast intended for outsiders. It was the stated position of the men who had built the skyline visible from the roof. Their working week ran from Sunday night, when they drove down from the Kahnawake reservation near Montreal, to Friday evening when they drove back. The round trip was 12 hours each way. They made it every week of the construction season. During those same years, the non-Mohawk ironworking workforce across the American building boom was composed primarily of Italian immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, and second-generation Irish workers, with significant representation from Puerto Rican workers in the New York market by the late 1920s. The structural ironworking trade was one of the highest-paid skilled trades available to immigrant labor in American cities, and the premium attracted men who were willing to accept the risk, because the alternative wages for unskilled labor could not support a family in a northeastern city at 1920s costs. The Labor Bureau records of New York State document construction fatalities from structural ironwork throughout this period without distinguishing between Mohawk and non-Mohawk workers. The fatality rate applied equally. The premium applied equally. The absence from the official building record applied to all of them. Lewis Hine photographed rivet gangs at work on the Empire State Building in 1930 and 1931. His photographs are in the Library of Congress. They show men walking open beams above the Manhattan grid, stepping across connections on structures with no floor yet behind them, standing at altitudes where the street below is not legible as a street. The photographs are among the most reproduced images in American industrial and documentary photography, and they are the primary visual record of what the rivet gang looked like from the outside. What does a photograph of a man walking an open beam 30 stories above Manhattan tell you about what he knew that made it possible? It tells you the beam was 4 inches wide. It tells you there was nothing below. It does not tell you what he knew. But the rivet gang was already operating on borrowed time when Hine made those photographs. The technology that would end it had been available since the 1890s in prototype form, and the engineering case for high-strength structural bolts had been building throughout the 1930s and the 1940s as bolt metallurgy improved. and as the productivity cost of maintaining hot riveting on tall structures became clearer to construction managers working in a competitive market. High-strength structural bolts, standardized by the American Institute of Steel Construction in specifications that evolved through the early 1950s, could produce the connection and clamping forces that hot-driven rivets achieved through contraction, but without the requirement of a four-man gang, a portable furnace, a 45-second window, and men catching iron out of the air at height. Impact wrenches replaced pneumatic rivet hammers. Connection work that had required 4 experienced men could be done by 2. The productivity gain was substantial, and the capital cost of the transition was manageable, and the structural steel industry adopted high-strength bolts, not through regulation, but through market preference. The transition was not regulated by any government agency. No safety bureau mandated the switch. The structural steel industry adopted bolted connections because they were more economical on tall structures. The cost of running compressed air to a furnace on the 40th floor, managing 4 men rather than 2 at each connection, and tolerating the reject rate of marginal rivets all compounded against the rivet gang as buildings got taller. The rivet gang did not lose a safety argument. It lost a cost argument, and the men who had built their trade on that skill were not compensated for the knowledge that left the industry with them. By the mid-1960s, hot riveting was no longer specified on major American structural steel projects. By the 1970s, it was effectively gone. The last Kahnawake gangs to work hot rivets on a major American structure are not precisely documented in the historical record, because the end of riveting did not arrive as a single event, but as a market transition that made the skill obsolete one contract at a time. What is documented is that the Kahnawake Ironworkers transitioned to bolted connection work as the market shifted, maintaining their presence in the New York structural iron trade through the second half of the 20th century. Mohawk Ironworkers worked the World Trade Center from 1966 through its completion in 1974. They were among the workers called back to the site in the weeks after September 2001. In 2013, Kahnawake Ironworkers placed the final section of the spire on One World Trade Center, the building constructed on the site of the towers their fathers and grandfathers had helped build. The buildings are still standing. Every rivet in them was driven by a 4-man gang within a 45-second window by men whose names are not in the building record. The Woolworth Building does not name them. The Chrysler Building does not name them. The Empire State Building does not name them. Louis Hine photographed them, and those photographs survive. And in the steel girder crosses at the Kahnawake Cemetery, the community named them in the only record they controlled. The rivet gang built the American city. The men who built it are not in the building's records. They're in Louis Hine's photographs and in the steel. Subscribe to Steel and Sweat and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. Thanks for watching.